I remember the exact moment my father's words sliced into me like a blade. The auditorium was alive with chatter, proud families fixing gowns and straightening caps, the smell of polished wood and faint perfume lingering in the air. I was adjusting my tassel, nerves buzzing, when I heard him lean toward Aunt Carol and mutter, "Hazel will never be as successful as Daniel, but at least she tried." My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightened, and for a moment the air seemed to leave the room. I froze, standing just a few feet away, my heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted to escape. His words weren't meant for me to hear, but they carried a cruel familiarity, one that echoed years of comparison and dismissal. That was the moment I realized today would not end the way he imagined. Today, I had a secret of my own, and it was waiting for the perfect stage. Since I was a child, my father's voice had been both the anchor and the chain that weighed me down. Every praise that should have been mine was rerouted to my brother, Daniel, as if I were simply existing in the background of his spotlight. When I painted, it was a nice hobby. When Daniel played the piano, it was a gift to the family. When I brought home grades that I had fought tooth and nail for, they were acceptable, but Daniel's scores were celebrated with dinners out and phone calls to every relative. My father, Richard, believed success was measured by accolades that could be flaunted, not by resilience quietly forged in silence. So I grew up swallowing my pride, carrying invisible bruises on my spirit. I became used to being unseen, even when standing right in front of him. And yet, in those unseen corners, I grew stronger. I had to. Every whispered dismissal, every casual remark that undermined me, became fuel for something I didn't yet know I was building. Unlike Daniel, I wasn't handed the family's approval like a polished trophy. I had to earn every fragment of dignity on my own. While Daniel's path was mapped neatly before him, scholarships, internships, connections, mine was littered with doubt and shadows. But those shadows taught me to navigate quietly, to dig into passions my father would never understand, and to nurture a strength that couldn't be measured by the yardstick of his approval. I often wondered if one day I'd be able to show him, not to seek validation, but to prove that I had never needed it in the first place. That day had finally arrived. My cap felt heavier than it should have, as though the weight of my past was pressing into my scalp, daring me to crumble under his words again. But this time, I was different. Behind my silence, I carried a secret that not even my mother, Evelyn, knew. For months, I had been preparing something that would not just mark my graduation, but redefine it. As I stood there listening to the shuffle of feet and the distant call of names, I smiled faintly to myself. My father thought today was about me standing in Daniel's shadow once again, but he was wrong. He didn't know the fire I had been nurturing and how it was about to ignite in front of everyone. I glanced toward the seats where my family sat. My mother's nervous smile was fixed in my direction, her eyes searching for mine as though she could sense my trembling beneath the gown. She had always been the quiet witness, caught between defending me and keeping peace with my father's unyielding expectations. Her silence was her survival, but I could see in her eyes that she carried a guilt she never spoke aloud. Beside her, Daniel sat with his easy charm, legs crossed, exchanging jokes with cousins, the golden child basking effortlessly in attention. And then there was Richard, my father, leaning back with the self-assured posture of a man who believed the story of this family had already been written. His story, his definition of success, his blind certainty that I would never measure up. The announcer's voice crackled through the speakers, calling for the ceremony to begin, and a hush fell over the crowd. My classmates began lining up, tassels bouncing, smiles wide and hopeful. I took my place in line, my fingers brushing the folded paper tucked secretly inside my gown. My speech. It wasn't listed in the program, and my father had no idea that the university had chosen me, of all people, as the surprise keynote speaker. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from anticipation. The words I had written weren't just for the graduates. They were for the little girl who had been told she was never enough, for the teenager who cried silently into her pillow after another dinner, where Daniel's achievements eclipsed hers, and for the woman who had fought her way here, carrying wounds that had become wings. The room filled with applause as the first graduates walked across the stage. Cameras flashed, proud cheers erupted, and one by one, names were called into existence with joy. I could hear the faint clapping of my family each time a student passed, but when my name was announced, I wondered what sound would follow. Would it be the half-hearted applause of a father convinced I was a shadow? Or would it be silence, the kind that confirmed I had never belonged in his idea of greatness. I shook off the thought. Today, I didn't need his applause. Today, I had something greater than his approval. I had the truth of who I was, and soon, everyone else would see it too. As I took my first step toward the stage, I remembered being 10 years old, standing outside the school gates with a science fair ribbon clutched in my sweaty hand. My father had looked at it with indifference, muttering, "It's not first place, Hazel." That moment had haunted me for years, shaping how I chased perfection, even when perfection wasn't what I wanted. But as the tassel brushed my cheek and the lights illuminated the path ahead, I realized something startling. I no longer craved his recognition. What I wanted was for him to see the daughter he had underestimated, the daughter who had been quietly building a life that didn't need his permission to shine. My lips curled into a smile, steady and sure. Today wasn't about Daniel. Today wasn't even about Richard. Today was about me. By the time I reached the stairs leading to the stage, my heart was pounding with a rhythm that felt like victory. My secret was safe for just a few more minutes, and the anticipation burned inside me like lightning ready to strike. My father thought he had already written my story, but he was about to watch me tear his version apart in front of everyone. I lifted my head, shoulders back, and with each step upward, I carried not just my name, but the years of silence, pain, and resilience that had brought me here. When the spotlight hit me, I knew the moment had come, the moment to let him know that I was not his disappointment, not his failure, and certainly not the shadow of my brother. I was Hazel, and today, the world was going to hear my name in a way he could never erase. Daniel had always been the measure against which I was judged, though no one ever asked if I wanted to play that game. From the moment he learned to walk, he seemed to glide effortlessly into achievement, his path lined with admiration. He had the kind of charisma that made people lean in, the kind of smile that made teachers favor him before he even opened his mouth. My earliest memories are filled with images of him on stages, piano recitals, debate competitions, sports ceremonies, while I stood in the audience, clapping until my hands stung, pretending I was proud, when inside I was crumbling. My father's hand always rested proudly on Daniel's shoulder, while mine was left hanging awkwardly at my side. Even as a child, I felt the sting of invisibility. When I was 9, I brought home a drawing that had won a district art competition. I'd poured hours into it, every stroke of the pencil holding my hopes for recognition. My teacher had told me, "Hazel, you have a gift," and I carried that praise like a fragile treasure. But when I showed my father, he glanced at it and muttered, "That's nice, but Daniel just got top marks in math." My smile faltered, and I learned once again that in this family, my worth was always measured against Daniel's triumphs. My mother tried to console me later, whispering, "I love your drawing, sweetheart," but even her kindness felt like a bandage over a wound that never stopped reopening. Daniel himself wasn't cruel. That was what made it worse. He was kind to me, in the way one might be kind to a younger cousin, never realizing the depth of my hunger for acknowledgement. He didn't rub his victories in my face because he didn't have to. The world did it for him. He excelled without trying, and I struggled without being seen. In some twisted way, his kindness made my father's favoritism more unbearable. If Daniel had been arrogant, I could have hated him, but instead I found myself resenting not him, but the way everyone else crowned him king while I was left a servant in his court. By high school, the comparisons had sharpened like knives. Daniel got into an elite program for gifted students, and my father boasted about it to anyone who would listen. When I tried to share that I had written a short story published in a local magazine, he nodded absently and said, "That's good, Hazel, but it's not something you can build a future on." I remember that night vividly, sitting at the dinner table, Daniel's achievements filling the air like a song, while my story, my first published words, felt like nothing more than background noise. That was when I started keeping my victories to myself, clutching them in silence, because celebrating them aloud only reminded me of how little they mattered to him. The only place I felt truly alive was in the library, the smell of old books, the hush of turning pages, the quiet weight of stories waiting to be discovered. It became my sanctuary. While my father was busy polishing Daniel's trophies, I was losing myself in words that gave me power, in characters who defied expectations, in authors who had clawed their way out of obscurity. That was when I began to dream of a life different from the one my father prescribed. I wanted to create something that couldn't be dismissed as not practical or not as impressive as your brother's. I wanted to write, to speak, to carve my own path, and though I never dared to say it out loud, A part of me wanted to prove him wrong. But proving him wrong wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. Each dismissal chipped away at me, making me question if I was worth anything at all. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if perhaps my father was right, if I was destined to always be the shadow. My mother's quiet reassurances weren't enough to silence the voice that repeated his words in my head. And yet, deep inside, a stubborn flame refused to go out. It told me to keep going, to hold on to the possibility that one day, I'd step out from behind Daniel's shadow and stand in a light of my own making. The closer graduation drew, the more that flame grew. I worked relentlessly, not only on my studies, but on something far more personal, my voice. I began writing speeches, essays, letters I never sent. I poured my pain onto paper, transforming it into words that had weight, words that mattered. For the first time, I wasn't writing for recognition. I was writing for me. I wanted to see if I could take the years of invisibility and turn them into something undeniable. My professors noticed, and for once, someone outside my family saw what I carried inside. One of them nominated me for the honor of speaking at graduation, and when I was chosen, I swore to myself I would make every second on that stage count. Now, as I waited in line to walk across the stage, I thought back to all those moments when I'd been silenced, overlooked, dismissed. I thought of the little girl with the drawing, the teenager with the published story, the young woman who had learned to fight for every scrap of acknowledgement. They were all pieces of me, and today, I was carrying them onto that stage. My father believed Daniel's story was the only one worth telling, but he had no idea that mine was about to eclipse his golden sun's, in a way he could never have imagined. My chest rose with determination as the line moved forward, step by step, toward the moment I had been waiting for my entire life. And though fear pulsed through me, I clutched it like a weapon, rather than a weakness. I had been underestimated too many times to falter now. This wasn't just a speech. This was my declaration, my truth, my rebellion against years of silence. And as I glanced one last time at my family in the crowd, my father's smug confidence made my stomach twist, but it also fueled me. He thought he knew what today would bring, but soon he would understand just how wrong he was. The auditorium buzzed with restless excitement as names were called, one after another, the sound of applause rising and fading like waves. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, each heartbeat reminding me that my moment was inching closer. The stage loomed ahead like a battlefield, and the thought of stepping onto it both terrified and electrified me. I tried to steady my breathing, gripping the small stack of papers in my hand, words I had rewritten countless times, words that were now etched into my soul. Around me, classmates shifted nervously, some rehearsing smiles, others whispering last-minute jokes to shake off the tension. But I remained silent, clutching my secret like a weapon no one else knew I carried. From where I stood, I could see my family in the audience. My mother sat with her hands neatly folded, her eyes scanning the program, though every so often she glanced nervously toward my father. He sat tall and rigid, his expression carved from stone, as though this event was a performance staged for him alone. And then there was Daniel, dressed sharply in a suit that made him look more like the keynote speaker than a guest. He exuded the quiet confidence that had always followed him, the kind that didn't need applause to validate it because he already expected it. A familiar knot tightened in my stomach, but I forced myself to breathe. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about me. When Daniel had graduated years earlier, the entire ceremony had practically turned into his show. He had received multiple awards, each one punctuated by my father's thunderous clapping and proud nods. People congratulated my parents afterward, as if they had raised a prodigy destined for greatness. I remembered standing in the background, invisible once again, listening to strangers praise my brother while I swallowed my envy like poison. But tonight would be different. Tonight, when they called my name, I wouldn't just walk across the stage, I would take the stage, and in doing so, I would finally take back the pieces of myself my father had dismissed for years. The line moved forward, and I shifted with it, my palms slick with sweat. Every instinct told me to run, to stay silent, to avoid the confrontation I had built my entire speech around. What if my words shattered everything? What if they ruined not only my father, but the fragile bond I still shared with my mother? The fear gnawed at me, whispering that I wasn't strong enough. But then I thought of the countless nights I had cried myself to sleep, convinced I would never be enough. I thought of the way my father's voice had drilled into me. Daniel is the one who will make us proud. And suddenly, My fear transformed into fire. I couldn't let him own my silence anymore. The first few names were called, and each graduate walked across the stage to polite applause. I tried to focus on them, but my mind was already in the speech I had memorized, my heart racing ahead to what I was about to do. My professors, who had chosen me for this honor, sat near the front, smiling in quiet encouragement. They had no idea the full extent of what I was about to reveal. To them, this was a student delivering an inspirational speech about perseverance and ambition. But in truth, this was more than inspiration. This was revelation, confession, and rebellion woven into words sharp enough to cut through years of silence. Finally, the moment came. "Hazel Thompson," the announcer's voice rang through the hall, and I stepped forward. Applause rose, scattered but genuine, and I forced a smile as I crossed the stage. My legs trembled beneath me, yet I walked as though I had rehearsed for this my entire life. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, and though the spotlight made the audience blur into shadows, I knew exactly where my family sat. I knew my father's expression hadn't changed. Expectant, dismissive, waiting to hear something safe, something that would never threaten his narrative of who I was supposed to be. I reached the podium and set my papers down, though I barely needed them. The microphone hummed as I adjusted it, and for a brief moment, I let the silence stretch. The audience quieted, leaning forward, expecting the usual platitudes of gratitude and hope. My heart hammered in my chest, but I steadied my voice, clear and strong. "Good evening," I began, my eyes scanning the crowd. "Tonight is not just about celebrating our achievements. It is about telling the truth, the kind of truth that often hides behind perfect photographs and proud smiles." A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. They hadn't expected this. Neither had my father. I spoke slowly at first, my words deliberate, carrying the weight of years of dismissal. For many of us, the journey here has not been smooth. Some of us have carried burdens invisible to the world, burdens of comparison, silence, and doubt. My voice wavered only slightly before I steadied it. For me, those burdens were born at home. I saw movement in the audience, a shifting unease, a collective inhale. My father leaned forward in his seat, his brows knitting together. He hadn't expected me to drag our family into the spotlight, and yet, that was exactly what I intended to do. For the first time in my life, I had their attention. Not just my classmates, not just the audience, but my father's. I felt the tremor of fear in my chest, but underneath it was a current of power I had never known. I wasn't the shadow anymore. I wasn't the silent child clapping for her brother. I was Hazel, and tonight, I would speak the truth that had been buried for far too long. And as I looked directly into my father's eyes across the crowd, I let the silence linger one moment longer, a silence that told him he had no idea what was about to come next. The first words had left my lips, and there was no turning back. I gripped the podium, not to steady my body, but to anchor myself against the storm I was about to unleash. The hall was silent now, every ear tuned to me, every eye waiting to hear what direction I would take. For as long as I can remember, I continued, I was told I had to measure myself against someone else, someone who was always taller, smarter, faster, better. I didn't need to say his name. Daniel sat there, the golden boy, his polished smile frozen in place. My father's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening on the armrest of his seat. For once I had their full attention, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. I could almost hear my father's voice in my head, cutting through me like it had so many times before. "Why can't you be more like him?" My chest burned as I spoke aloud what I had carried in silence for years. Every achievement I earned was diminished, every effort overshadowed. No matter how hard I tried, I was never the one who made him proud. I was told I'd never be enough, not compared to my brother. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some gasped, others leaned closer, as if hearing a confession they were never meant to know. This wasn't the glossy speech they had expected. This was truth, raw and unpolished, dripping with the pain of a daughter who had lived too long in the shadow of conditional love. Daniel's expression flickered, a crack in his mask of calm. He lowered his gaze, perhaps realizing the weight of the role he had unknowingly played in my torment. My father, however, was not so easily moved. His stare was a mixture of fury and disbelief, as if daring me to continue. But I didn't falter. If anything, his glare fueled me. I know many of you might be thinking, why bring family matters here, tonight of all nights? But sometimes the truth demands to be spoken when the world is listening. And tonight, the world is listening. My voice grew stronger, steadier, as though years of silence had suddenly transformed into fire. I looked around at the audience, at my professors who had seen me as more than just a comparison, at classmates who had cheered me on in small victories my father had never noticed. "This degree," I said, lifting the certificate I had just been handed, "is not just a piece of paper. It is proof that I am more than the limitations others placed on me. It is proof that even when someone tells you that you will never measure up, you can still rise, still fight, still claim your own place." A wave of applause began hesitantly, but quickly swelled as the audience recognized the courage in my words. Their support emboldened me, but I knew the hardest part was still ahead, because the truth I carried wasn't just about neglect or comparison or years of feeling invisible. It was deeper, darker, a wound I had hidden even from myself for too long. My hands trembled as I gripped the podium again. "But there's something else," I said, my voice lowering, drawing the room in tighter. The applause faded instantly, replaced by the heavy stillness of anticipation. "Something I have carried for years, something I've never said aloud, not to my friends, not to my teachers, not even to the people sitting in this room tonight." My father stiffened. My mother's hand rose to her lips, her eyes widening with fear. They knew something was coming, though not what. I let the silence stretch, my heart pounding so loudly, it felt as though it echoed across the room. When you're told your whole life that you are less than, you begin to believe it. And when you believe it, you let people treat you in ways you shouldn't. You accept the silence. You accept the neglect. You accept the cruelty. My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "But I am done accepting." The audience seemed to hold its breath. Even Daniel, once the symbol of perfection, now looked shaken, as if he too was beginning to question the story our father had written for us all. I turned my gaze directly on my father, my words no longer for the audience but for him. "You said, at my graduation, that I would never be as successful as my brother. You said those words like they were law, as if my life had already been decided before I even began. But here I am, standing on this stage, speaking words you never expected to hear, holding proof you never thought I could earn." My father shifted uncomfortably, his chest rising and falling with restrained anger. For once, the man who always had the last word sat silent, unable to control the story being told. The applause came again, louder this time, but I barely heard it. I was lost in the storm of my own emotions, in the catharsis of finally letting the truth breathe. For years, I had lived waiting for his approval, aching for him to see me as more than Daniel's shadow. And now, I realized with sudden clarity, I didn't need his approval anymore. My worth wasn't something he could give or take away. It was mine, and tonight, I was claiming it in front of the world. The clapping still echoed through the auditorium when I raised my hand, silencing it with a single gesture. The noise fell away instantly, like a wave retreating from the shore, leaving behind a tense quietness. My heart hammered, but my voice came out steady. "But there's something you all don't know, something my family has kept buried, something that has haunted me every single day of my life." Murmurs rippled across the audience, eyes widened, and I could see my professors leaning forward as if afraid to miss a word. My mother's lips trembled, her hands gripping her knees tightly. My father's eyes, sharp and furious, warned me not to continue. But for the first time, his threats had no power over me. "I wasn't just compared to my brother," I said, my voice slicing through the thick silence. "I was made invisible. I was made to feel like my dreams were worthless, like my voice didn't matter. And when I cried out for help, when I begged for someone to notice, they looked the other way." The audience stiffened. Whispers spread across the room like sparks on dry grass. My father's fists clenched, his knuckles white, his breathing heavy, as if he could crush my words before they reached another ear. But they were already loose, already finding their way into the hearts of everyone listening. I turned my gaze toward Daniel. His face was pale now, stripped of the confident charm he always wore so effortlessly. His eyes flickered with something like guilt, something he had hidden as carefully as I had hidden my pain. "You know, don't you?" I asked him, my voice trembling, but firm. He flinched, his jaw tightening as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The audience gasped softly, sensing the weight of the unspoken. My words weren't just accusations anymore. They were revelations, sharp enough to pierce the careful image of perfection my family had painted for years. "When I was 16, I continued, forcing the words past the lump in my throat, I discovered something that changed the way I saw my family forever. I realized that the pedestal my brother stood on was built from the pieces of my silence, my pain, and my sacrifices. I paused, letting the words hang, letting their heaviness sink into the room. The silence was unbearable. Every breath, every heartbeat seemed suspended. And then I said it. Daniel wasn't just the golden child. He was the reason my cries for help were ignored, because protecting him meant silencing me. The hall erupted with gasps, professors whispering, classmates staring at Daniel in shock. My father stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. His face was red, his voice a growl barely contained. "Enough, Hazel. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." But I didn't flinch, not this time. Instead, I lifted my chin and spoke louder, stronger, the truth pulsing through my veins. "No, Dad. I'm not embarrassing myself. I'm freeing myself. For years, you told me I was less than him, that I would never reach his level. But you never admitted why. Because to admit it would expose the truth you've been hiding all along." The audience turned, every eye locked on my father now, their judgment heavy. Daniel finally rose, his face pale and his voice trembling. "Hazel, don't." But his warning only confirmed what I was saying. My classmates murmured, their trust in him crumbling with each second. I clenched the podium until my knuckles ached, forcing the next words out despite the fear tearing through me. "When I was at my weakest, when I needed protection, you weren't there for me, Daniel. And you, Dad, you knew. You chose to protect him instead of me. You chose silence over truth." The air in the room grew heavier, charged with disbelief and horror. My mother buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. The audience was no longer clapping or gasping. They were utterly still, straining to catch each syllable, to understand the depth of what was being revealed. I could feel their pity, their outrage, their silent solidarity. But I wasn't speaking for them. I was speaking for myself, for the girl who had been silenced for too long. My voice cracked, but I pressed forward. I carried this pain alone, because I was made to believe that speaking out would destroy the family. But the truth is, the family was already broken the moment silence became more important than justice. My father's face drained of color, his power crumbling under the weight of exposure. Daniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his confidence shattered, his image ruined. I stood taller, my chest rising with each breath, my truth no longer a burden but a weapon. "Tonight," I said, "I am no longer the shadow. I am the voice, and I refuse to let your lies define me any longer." The room erupted, not in applause this time, but in stunned silence, the kind that comes when the world you thought you knew has just been ripped apart before your eyes. The tension in the auditorium reached a breaking point when my father slammed his hand down on the railing of his seat and bellowed, "Enough! This charade ends now!" His voice thundered through the hall, making several people flinch. But instead of silencing me, his outburst only confirmed what I had just revealed. His face was red with fury, veins bulging on his neck, as if he could strangle the truth out of me with sheer rage. The silence of the audience turned into sharp judgment. Whispers spread, questioning why a father would erupt so violently at his own daughter during her moment of triumph. I steadied myself, forcing the tremor out of my voice. "Why are you so afraid, Dad?" I asked, letting my words cut through the heavy air. "Afraid people might finally see you for who you are? Afraid the mask you've worn for years will fall?" The murmurs grew louder, and I could see teachers shaking their heads, classmates leaning closer, caught in the storm of revelation. My father's fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving, but his anger only made him look smaller, more desperate. For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking under his glare. I was rising above it. Daniel tried to intervene, his voice breaking as he shouted, "Hazel, please stop this before you regret it." But his plea rang hollow. Everyone could see his fear, his guilt written across his pale face. I turned toward him, my expression unyielding. "Regret? Daniel, the only regret I carry is staying silent for so long while you basked in praise built on lies." He looked as though the ground beneath him was crumbling, his confident image reduced to ashes. The audience's eyes burned holes into him, questions forming that he could no longer dodge. His silence, once his shield, had become his greatest betrayal. My father's voice returned, rough and uneven. "You're twisting things, Hazel, making up stories to humiliate us, to humiliate this family." His desperation cracked through every word, but the more he shouted, the more he exposed himself. I didn't hesitate. I reached into my folder and pulled out a single envelope, the one I had carried for years, waiting for this exact moment. "If I were making it up, Dad," I said, holding it high for everyone to see, "then why do I have this?" The room collectively leaned forward, breathless, their eyes locked on the envelope as if it contained the very heartbeat of the story. I walked down the steps of the stage slowly, deliberately, my heels clicking against the polished floor, each sound a drumbeat of defiance. Standing before my father, I extended the envelope toward the audience instead of him. Inside this envelope are letters I wrote as a teenager, begging for help. Letters that I sent to a family friend because I couldn't trust my own home. And do you know what's inside those letters? My truth, my cries for protection. Proof that I wasn't invisible, that I was silenced deliberately. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The air was thick with disbelief, anger, and sorrow. My father lunged forward, trying to snatch the envelope from my hands, but I pulled back before he could reach it. The move exposed him fully. A man desperate to bury the truth, willing to tear it from his daughter's hands in front of hundreds of witnesses. Teachers stood, some stepping closer as if to protect me from him. The audience hissed disapproval, their respect for him shattering as quickly as his composure. "Sit down," someone from the crowd shouted. For the first time, the command wasn't his to give. It was directed at him. I turned back to the stage and placed the envelope on the podium, my hands steady despite the storm swirling inside me. "This is no longer just my burden," I said, my voice ringing with clarity. "This is evidence. Evidence of what I endured, of what my family forced me to carry in silence. And if you think you can bury it, Dad, think again, because it's no longer hidden in the shadows. It's here, in the light, where it belongs." The envelope glared under the spotlight, a fragile paper fortress that carried the weight of years of suffering, now turned into undeniable truth. My father sank back into his seat, his face drained of power, his body slumping as though the truth had finally broken his spine. My mother sobbed quietly beside him, her tears falling freely now that denial could no longer protect her. Daniel sat frozen, his lips trembling, his mask shattered. And me, I stood taller than I ever had in my life, a fire blazing in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't the forgotten daughter, the shadow beneath my brother's light. I was the voice that could no longer be silenced, and the world had just heard me roar. The silence in the auditorium was deafening after my last words, but it didn't last long. A professor from the front row stood up, adjusting his glasses with a trembling hand. "Daniel," he called out, his voice stern but shaking with disbelief. "Is this true? Did you know about these letters?" Every eye in the room turned toward my brother, the man who had been painted as the family's masterpiece. Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came. He looked like a man caught in the sudden glare of a spotlight, no longer able to hide in shadows. His silence was damning, louder than any confession he could have spoken. Murmurs swelled like a rising tide, students twisting in their seats to look at one another. Words like liar, fraud, and coward floated in the air, piercing Daniel's carefully constructed armor. For years, he had stood untouchable, the favored son, the untarnished success. Now, that image crumbled with every second he failed to speak. His hands trembled against his knees, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. I watched him unravel, piece by piece, the mask he wore for so long slipping until all that remained was the naked truth. A man too afraid to admit he had built his success on silence and complicity. Daniel finally rose from his seat, his movements jerky, his voice cracking. I didn't know," he stammered, but even as the words left his mouth, the crowd erupted with disbelieving scoffs. He wiped at his forehead with a shaking hand, his eyes darting toward my father as if begging for a lifeline. My father glared back at him, furious and betrayed, no longer the shield he once was. "Don't you dare look at me," Dad hissed, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "This is your mess now." Daniel's shoulders hunched, his body folding inward as though the weight of both our father's fury and the crowd's contempt was breaking him in half. I stepped closer to him, my voice sharp but steady. "You didn't know? Then explain the nights I heard you laughing with Dad while I cried behind my door. Explain the times you told me to toughen up when you knew I was drowning. Explain how you accepted every ounce of praise he gave you for being the perfect child, while I was silenced for the crime of existing." My words cut like blades, slicing through the last of his defenses. Daniel's mouth opened again, but all he could muster was a broken, I I didn't think it mattered that much. The audience gasped. Students shook their heads in disbelief. Professors muttered under their breath, some even scribbling notes as if the scandal unfolding before them needed documentation. I took a deep breath, allowing the fury that had built over years to channel into precision. Didn't matter? I repeated, my tone trembling with emotion. My pain didn't matter. My worth didn't matter. As long as you got to keep your shiny reputation, everything else could rot in the dark. That's who you are, Daniel. Not a golden boy, not a hero, just a coward who chose silence because it was easier. His face crumpled as the truth stripped him bare. A classmate stood up, a young man from the engineering department, his voice echoing across the hall. Hazel's stronger than you'll ever be. She stood up here and told the truth. All you've done is hide. Applause erupted, first tentative, then growing, until the sound rolled through the auditorium like thunder. It wasn't just applause for me. It was the audience rejecting Daniel's hollow perfection. The power that had once been his was gone, slipping into my hands, into the truth that could no longer be buried. Daniel lowered his head, unable to withstand the storm of judgment raining down on him. My mother tried to stand, tears streaking her face, her voice weak as she pleaded, "Please stop this. Please, it's enough." But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I turned toward her, my eyes softer than they had been for Daniel or my father. "Mom, the truth doesn't destroy families. Silence does. Don't ask me to stop. Ask them why they kept me voiceless." She crumpled back into her chair, sobbing quietly, no longer able to defend the illusions that had suffocated us for so long. The spotlight shifted entirely now, from me to Daniel, from the oppressed to the oppressor, and everyone demanded answers he could no longer give. By the time Daniel sat down, his head in his hands, I knew the tides had turned forever. The golden boy was gone, exposed as hollow, his legacy of superiority shattered under the weight of truth. I felt my heart pounding, adrenaline rushing through my veins, but beneath it was something deeper, release. For the first time, I wasn't the shadow to his light. I was the fire, and nothing could extinguish me now. Yet, I also knew something else. This wasn't the end. The applause, the shame, the judgment, they were only the prelude, because the real climax hadn't arrived yet. That was still waiting in the wings. The applause still thundered in my ears as I gripped the podium, my breath uneven, but strong. Daniel sat crumpled in his chair, my father fuming beside him, my mother reduced to silent tears. For a fleeting moment, I thought about ending it there, letting the storm consume them and walking away. But something deeper burned inside me, something that refused to remain unsaid. For years, I had carried not just my father's disdain or Daniel's complicity, but a truth so heavy it nearly destroyed me. If I stopped now, I would be no better than them, hiding behind silence. My heart pounded as I leaned closer to the microphone. "I haven't told you everything," I began, and instantly the auditorium hushed again, the applause dying mid-echo. The audience leaned forward, breaths caught in their throats, sensing the shift. I looked at my father, who narrowed his eyes, and at Daniel, who lifted his head, a flicker of panic breaking through his shame. "You all think this is about favoritism, about a father who praised one child and crushed the other. But it's deeper, much deeper. It's about what happens when you bury someone's worth so completely that they believe they have nothing left." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, because there was a time I almost proved him right. Gasps rippled across the room, but I pressed on, the memory sharp, painful. 3 years ago, after yet another night of hearing Dad tell Daniel how proud he was, while reminding me I'd never measure up, I went to the river. I stood on the bridge, ready to end it. My voice cracked, but I refused to let the tears stop me. I thought maybe if I disappeared, if I erased myself, it would finally give them the peace they seemed to want. I thought my absence would hurt less than my existence. A stunned silence fell. Even the restless shuffling of seats had ceased. The weight of my confession hung heavy in the air. I turned my gaze directly to my father. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, but there was fear in his eyes, fear that this truth might stain him beyond repair. "And do you know what stopped me?" I asked. "It wasn't you. It wasn't Mom. It wasn't Daniel. It was a stranger who saw me and told me I had worth. A stranger who believed in me more than my own family ever had. That night, I promised myself if I ever survived this, I would not let silence bury me again." My words rang with defiance, and I could see the shock etched into every face in the room. Murmurs surged again, but this time not against me, They rose against my father, against Daniel, against the cruelty that had driven me to the edge. A professor pressed a hand to her chest, visibly shaken. Students whispered, some glaring openly at my family. My father shifted in his chair, visibly unsettled, sweat glistening on his temples. He had built his image on control, but now the walls he constructed were collapsing, brick by brick, as the truth clawed its way into the open. Daniel opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I steadied my voice, though my body trembled. Do you understand now? This was never about who was more successful, who wore the golden crown. This was about survival, about how your words, Dad, poisoned me so deeply I almost couldn't claw my way back. And Daniel, you were too busy basking in his approval to notice I was fading. You didn't just fail me as a brother. You abandoned me. The audience shifted uncomfortably, not from disbelief, but from the rawness of my words. Some nodded slowly, visibly moved, others covering their mouths in quiet horror. My mother finally whispered through tears, "Hazel, why didn't you tell us?" Her voice cracked, desperate, but I only shook my head. "Because I knew you wouldn't listen," I replied, my tone soft but steady. "Because every time I tried to speak, Dad drowned me out with his love for Daniel. And you turned away, and I am done being ignored." My mother collapsed into her hands, sobbing harder, while my father stared at me, stone-faced, the crowd's judgment tightening around him like a noose. Daniel stared at the floor, his entire frame trembling, shame consuming him. When I looked back at the audience, I saw something I never expected. People rising to their feet, not in applause this time, but in solidarity. One by one, students stood, some with tears in their eyes, some with fists clenched, as though declaring that they had witnessed too much silence in their own lives too. It wasn't just my story anymore. It had become a mirror for every unseen pain in that room. And as I stood at the podium, heart hammering, I realized this wasn't just my fight for truth. This was a reckoning, and my father wasn't ready for the next blow still waiting to land. For a long, suffocating second, my father didn't move. His face was rigid, his jaw locked, but I could see the twitch of his hands, as if he were holding back an explosion. The silence in the hall was unbearable, broken only by muffled sobs from my mother. Then, suddenly, his chair screeched back across the floor as he shot to his feet. His voice thundered, raw and unrestrained, louder than I had ever heard it before. "How dare you?" he bellowed, pointing at me, his finger trembling with rage. The audience recoiled at the force of it. "How dare you drag our family name through the mud like this?" His carefully constructed mask of power was shattering in real time, and the cracks were blinding. I stood firm, even as his fury bore down on me. "How dare I?" I shot back, the microphone amplifying every syllable. "You should be asking yourself how you dared to crush me day after day, to strip me of my worth until there was nothing left. I almost died because of you." My words sliced through his anger, and for the first time he faltered. His body shook, though whether from rage or shame, I couldn't tell. Around us, the audience wasn't afraid of me anymore. They were afraid of him. Students leaned away from him. Professors exchanged horrified glances. My father had come to this ceremony thinking he was untouchable. Now he was being dismantled before hundreds of eyes. Daniel, pale and sweating, finally rose to his feet. His lips trembled, his voice breaking. "Dad, stop." The words were quiet, almost childlike, but the weight behind them was enough to still the air. My father whipped around, glaring at him. "Don't you dare side with her," he snarled. "You're my son. You're the one who carried my pride, my name. Don't betray me like this." But Daniel didn't sit back down. His legs wobbled, his fists clenched at his sides, and for the first time in my life, he looked like a man caught between two cages, the one my father built for him and the one he had built for himself. His eyes flicked toward me, and I saw a decision burning there. "I can't do this anymore," Daniel said, louder this time, his voice resonating across the hall. "I can't keep pretending I didn't see what you did to her. I knew. I saw her breaking and I said nothing because I didn't want to lose your approval." His voice cracked, shame flooding each word. "But I can't carry your legacy if it means burying Hazel. She deserves more than this." Gasps burst through the crowd. Some students even clapped instinctively. My father's face twisted with betrayal, his chest heaving, his veins bulging at his temples. He had always counted on Daniel's loyalty. To see his golden son defy him now was the deepest wound of all. "Shut up!" my father roared, lunging toward Daniel as though he could drag him back into submission by sheer force. But Daniel didn't move. He stood his ground, though his shoulders quaked under the weight of years of silence finally breaking apart. My mother screamed, rushing between them, her hands outstretched, tears blurring her face. "Stop it! Please stop!" she cried. But it was too late. The damage was irreversible. The audience watched in stunned horror as a father tried to choke down the rebellion of his own children, and the family portrait he had painted for decades dissolved into ashes before their eyes. I gripped the podium so tightly my knuckles ached, my breath ragged, but I knew this was the moment. "You always said Daniel was the crown of this family, the symbol of success," I said, my voice low but cutting. "But look at him now, Dad. He's not standing beside you. He's standing beside me. And that crown you worshipped, it's broken. You broke it yourself." My father froze, his face collapsing under the weight of truth. The hall erupted with whispers and gasps, but his eyes never left mine. For the first time in my life, I saw not power in his gaze but fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of being unmasked, fear of losing control forever. His knees buckled. He stumbled backward into his chair, his hand clutching his chest as if the words had physically pierced him. My mother screamed his name, rushing to his side, but he pushed her away, his pride refusing pity. Daniel hesitated before moving to steady him, but my father shoved him too, snarling, "Don't touch me." He wanted control, even as it slipped through his fingers like sand. The crowd had turned fully against him, eyes wide with disgust, some shaking their heads, others whispering words like abusive, cruel, shameful. The man who once commanded every room now sat small, shaking, and alone. I leaned closer to the microphone, my voice steady despite the chaos. "This isn't just my graduation. This is my rebirth. And if anyone here still believes success is about crowns and comparisons, look at him." I pointed at my father, trembling, pale, and broken. That is what happens when you spend a lifetime crushing others to stand taller. You end up a hollow man with nothing left but anger and regret. The audience fell silent again, not from fear, but from reverence. They were listening, truly listening, and the man who had silenced me all my life couldn't stop them anymore. Daniel looked at me then, tears brimming in his eyes, and whispered so softly I almost didn't hear it, "I'm sorry." And in that single moment, with my father unraveling, my mother sobbing, and Daniel finally breaking his silence, I realized the war I had been fighting wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours. The walls of our family had cracked open, exposing the rot inside, and though the collapse was terrifying, it was also freeing. The crown was gone. The kingdom was dust. And for the first time, I wasn't the shadow anymore. I was the fire. The auditorium was heavy with silence, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for me to deliver the final blow. My father sat hunched, broken in his chair, clutching at pride that slipped away with every second. Daniel stood, still trembling but resolute, his betrayal of silence echoing louder than any words. My mother wept quietly, her hands covering her face, as if wishing the earth would swallow her whole. And me? I felt both hollow and whole at once, the weight of years colliding with the lightness of truth finally spoken. But I wasn't finished. They thought my speech had ended with his collapse. No, this was only the beginning. I took a slow breath, my chest burning with both fear and liberation. "You see, this moment isn't just about me proving my worth," I said, scanning the sea of eyes fixed on me. "It's about revealing what true success looks like. Success isn't medals, it isn't money, it isn't crowns placed on chosen children while the others are left starving for love." I paused, letting the silence expand, every face tilted forward. It's about survival, about resilience, and about choosing to rise even when the ground beneath you is crumbling. My voice quivered, but I held it firm. Then I added, almost in a whisper, "And I have proof of just how far I've come." From beneath my gown, I pulled a small folder, one I had kept hidden even from Daniel. My father's eyes locked on it instantly, suspicion sparking in his glare. "What is that?" he hissed, but his voice no longer carried authority. I opened it slowly, deliberately, showing the pages to the audience before I even explained. The seal of the university glistened under the stage lights, but it wasn't a diploma. No, it was thicker, heavier, carrying far more weight. "This," I said, my voice trembling with both nerves and triumph, "is the acceptance letter to the doctoral fellowship I've been awarded, not in the shadow of my brother, not under your name, but under my own. Today, I walk not just as a graduate, but as the youngest professor this university has ever appointed." A collective gasp rippled across the room. Daniel's eyes widened, his mouth parting as if words had abandoned him. My mother froze mid-cry, her fingers trembling against her lips. But it was my father who reacted most violently. He shot upright, eyes bulging, his face ghostly pale. "No," he muttered, shaking his head as if to erase the truth. "No, that's not possible. Not you. You were never—" His words fractured under the weight of his disbelief. For a man who had always believed worth could be measured in titles and accolades, to see the daughter he had called weak surpass, even his golden son, was a death blow to his pride. He staggered, clutching at the chair for support, as if the stage itself were tilting beneath him. I let the silence hang, savoring the moment, but I didn't let it become cruelty. "You told me I would never be as successful as Daniel," I said softly, yet the microphone carried my words like fire across the room. "But today, I don't stand here to compete with him. I stand here to prove that your voice, your cruelty, your endless comparisons, none of it could bury me. You tried, Dad. You nearly succeeded. But I rose higher than even you could dream." I closed the folder with a soft thud that echoed like a gavel, final and irreversible. The hall erupted into applause, louder than thunder, the sound shaking the walls and drowning out my father's broken mutters. Daniel was crying openly now, his face red, his hands trembling as he clapped along with the crowd. His eyes met mine, and though guilt still lingered, pride shone through. He mouthed a single word, "Finally," and I felt a warmth spread through me. For so long, I had chased scraps of acknowledgement, begged for recognition in a house built on silence and shadows. But now, recognition came not from my father, not even from my brother, but from within me, and from every voice cheering my name in that room. For the first time, I didn't just exist. I was seen. My father sank back down, his chest heaving, his lips trembling with words he couldn't form. He looked at me like he was staring at a stranger, someone he could no longer control, no longer belittle, no longer define. Perhaps for him, that was the cruelest twist of all, realizing his own daughter had broken free, soared past the chains he had bound her with, and left him behind in a storm of his own making. He tried to shout again, but his voice cracked into silence. The king had fallen, the crown shattered, and all that remained was the hollow echo of his downfall. When the ceremony ended, students and professors alike swarmed me, their congratulations pouring in, their hands shaking mine, their voices calling my name. Yet even in the whirlwind of celebration, my eyes found my father one last time. He was slumped in his seat, defeated, his hands trembling. My mother tried to lift him, but he shrugged her off, too proud even in ruin to accept help. Daniel hovered beside them, torn between loyalty and freedom, but I knew then that his chains too would one day snap. For now, the choice was his. As for me, my choice had already been made. I would never bow again. As I walked off the stage, diploma in one hand, and the fellowship letter in the other, I felt lighter than I ever had. The ghosts of my father's words still lingered, whispering their poison in the corners of my mind, but they no longer held power, because I had rewritten the ending. My story wasn't one of shadows or comparisons anymore. It was one of light, survival, and defiance. And as the crowd's applause followed me out the door, I knew with certainty, sometimes the greatest revenge isn't anger or cruelty, or even vengeance itself. Sometimes, the greatest revenge is becoming everything they swore you could never be. Thank you so much for staying until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed it and want more intense, emotional stories with shocking twists, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Like, share, and comment. Your support helps these stories keep growing, because every story hides a secret, and the next one might be even more shocking. Subscribe now and join me on this journey of emotions and revelations.